transformative SEL. We'll talk more about what that is later on tonight. But the thing that's most important to know about that transformative SEL model is it's based on something called intersectionality. And if you've never heard the word intersectionality before, it was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is credited as the architect of CRT. So we found that the Teachers Union, the AFT, also endorses this transformative SEL and has been working with CASEL since 2019 to advance equity and social justice-oriented versions of SEL throughout the school and the community. This applies to parents as well. So what we found is SEL is being used as a Trojan horse to promote at least one aspect of critical race theory in schools. But the biggest issue that we have, and you probably are in touch with this as well, is building awareness about this issue of my parents need to care. Most parents don't know what's going on inside the classroom. Most parents found out last week that white privilege had been taught in our high school since 2014. And many of us just found out through COVID that we had this window into the classroom we never really had before. It woke up so many parents when we saw what was going on. Parents that wanted to have a say in what's going on in their children's classroom, parents that wanted to understand how the social emotional learning was being directed, but most importantly, who was directing, whether it's the parents or the schools. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Kevin Smith. I'm the former superintendent here at Bethel, also the former middle school principal. I am now currently the superintendent down in Wilton, not too far from here. I also, probably most importantly, am a father of 5 students, ages 11 to 16. And so, Billy, when you say there are no parents of young kids here, you can say there's at least a couple in the room. And I think about SEL all the time, and I'm very interested in your comments. It sounds like one of my purposes for being here tonight, in addition to listening and learning, is also to hope that we can come to some common agreement on terms and definitions. From my perspective, oftentimes when we enter a conversation around these terms or acronyms, we find folks who are talking past each other because they're talking about different ideas. And so I'm hoping tonight we can at least stand on common ground and develop some shared understanding. So thanks for being here.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm Attorney Deborah Stevenson. I'm from Southbury, although I'm in Bethel and out here with my kids. I have two younger kids when they were younger, 4 years. Not in school, but they were practicing with the sparklers from 4 years ago, so hug that in Bethel a lot. Anyway, who I am, again, I have two daughters, they're grown now, but I homeschool them. And I homeschool them not because I had this notion of homeschooling is great, no, and we are my pediatrician actually suggested it at the time. It worked for us. My first child entered college at the age of 11, and the second child entered college at the age of 10. The first one graduated college at 16, and the other graduated college at 15. The older one got a full scholarship to get her master's degree in astronomy, and the younger daughter got her bachelor's degree also in medicine and whatnot. But the older one now is a professor at UC Santa Barbara in climatology. So yeah, it can work, but it's not for everyone, and there is absolutely a need for public schools. But the reason I tell you that story is because I had to fight for my children and their right to be educated in a manner that they needed. So that's how I got involved in the capital, what our rights are and all of that, just like a parent. I was not a lawyer at the time. I actually went to law school while I was homeschooling. I did that at night. And because I figured, well, if I'm going to be doing this, I might as well get a degree and see what I actually am supposed to be doing. So one of the reasons also I became a lawyer is because I hate lawyers. Okay? It's true, it's true. They do it so bad, So, but anyway, I do love my country, and I love my freedom, and the kids' freedom, and freedom for all of us coming up, our grandkids, and the future of this country. And that's why I became a lawyer, and that's why I fight for the rights of individuals of all kinds. My practice primarily is in education about law and constitutional law, civil litigation, civil rights, that kind of thing. So anyway, thank you for inviting me here, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, panelists. So the idea of tonight is kind of what Kevin just said about talking past each other. There seems to be a lot of confusion or confusion about what SEL is. And I think that, Deborah, you brought up a good point, is educating children in the way that they should be educated. I think both sides and even in the middle all agree how children should be taught. But we wanted to put a finer point on it and to get people of all stripes who believe different things and ask questions, get some answers, and see where it all falls. Because I don't know of any other place or organization around here who is doing anything with this. I'm the chairman. I'm speaking for Deal. I'm the chairman of the Board of Finance here in Bethel. I am also the chairman of the Bethel Independent Town Committee, and I'm also a member of the Strategic Planning Commission for the Board of Education. So that's what really piqued my interest, because I knew I was going to be doing that. And I realized after we had one meeting, but even before that, there was just such disparate views on this whole thing, and it became there is part of the community here that it's very mysterious, the concept of SEL. And we only see parts of it. It's like they say that the the blind people touching the elephant, they don't even know what it is. So what I want to do, sort of fills on these stuff, is see if anyone wants to ask a question, or if no one wants to ask a question, I will ask a question, or Billy will ask a question. Someone's going to ask a question. Did you want to ask a question?
What is SEL? What is effective learning? Everybody we know what we're talking about, because there's so much going on now.
Let's start there. Okay. Yeah, there is for me, I look at the whole picture, okay? And I have to start at the beginning. And the beginning for me always is with the law. And where we get our rights from, we get them because we're born with them. Declaration of Independence, that they are unalienable, and we need to have government to protect our rights. That's their sole purpose, is to protect our rights. Unfortunately, what has happened today is through time. I want to say one more thing. The federal government that we formed, we only gave them some of our rights in order to protect us and our other remaining rights. We gave them some rights and some powers. We did not give them any right over education, parents, or children. That is not written in the Constitution. The only rights the government has, the federal government has, are those that we specifically enumerated in the Constitution as their rights and powers. So if you look at the Constitution, you cannot find the word education, parents, or children in it. So what has happened is through time, that has changed. I could start farther back, but I started looking at this thing in the 1960s. And this is bipartisan, is when this happened, of our rights being ceded to the federal government. Education in 1965. This was with Johnson, where we started giving federal money to the states on conditions. Okay, and that's how they do it. They don't do it through a direct authoritarian line of law to the states and to the people, as other rights are enumerated in the Constitution. But they use a taxing and spending power, and they hold out a carrot and a stick. So if you states will accept this money, we have some conditions for you for accepting the money, but if you agree with you, Jackie, about the transformative SEL. That is the worst. And I do agree with you about case homework castle and Romero said. Because what they did, and to your point about the effective domain and all these standards, I'm just going to touch on a couple of things. When we in 2000, we had goals 2000, then we had Common Core. All this is the same thing. It's the federal government giving the states money to do their bidding on education. And so you can say no to this money, but nobody ever does. So if you accept the money, you're going to have to accept those conditions. And the testing, we had the adaptive testing began under Common Core. And the adaptive testing went to this, pardon me, I'm a lawyer, I'm not an educator, I use all these terms, effective domain and all of that. And basically what it means is they put in algorithms in these computers, and that gets to the Google Chromebooks and all of this. And so it's not like we grew up when we had a test, the teacher develops a test, it's on a piece of paper, you write your answers, the teacher has what the questions are, and knows that. The adaptive testing is something different. It's on the computer. And the algorithm shoots out the questions according to the responses of the child. And if the child can answer one question, then the computer goes to the next question, which may be harder and harder and harder until the child can't do it anymore. Now, I don't know, but it used to be that the teacher could not see those questions and doesn't really have an idea of what was tested, in essence, and the parents can't get a copy of that test either. So you have a computer doing this all through Google Chromebooks and these other adaptive places, CASEL, and all these think tanks and everything that come up with these ideas. And SEL is part of that. So we went from Goals 2000 to Common Core to the adaptive testing. And where does that data go? It's on the computer. And then the issue of data privacy. That data goes not just to the teachers, to the schools, it goes to the State Department of Education, State Labor Department, it goes down to the U.S. Department of Education, the U.S. Labor Department, and at one point at least, a few years ago, it went to a third party over in California, the behavioral analytics company, to assess all of this data, and to third parties to create even more testing and curriculum, that kind of thing. So then it goes on and expands to, now we have SEL. So, and they had to change the FERPA laws and the data privacy laws too in order to collect this data and give it to third parties. So the SEL is basically what they call is a lever for equity and excellence. Now, if you can look this up yourself from a 2019 paper that the creators of this SEL through Castle had done, and they wrote out all of their ideas about what this is, and especially transformative SEL. So transformative SEL focuses now on issues of race and ethnicity as a first step toward addressing the broader range of extant inequities. That's what they say themselves in this paper. They say it's anchored in the notion of justice-oriented citizenship. They discuss issues of culture, identity, agency, belonging, and engagement as relevant expressions of this 5 core competencies. They must cultivate in students the knowledge, attitudes, and skills required for critical examination and collaborative action to address root causes of inequities. And the programming involves gender and racial equity that helps students identify their own biases and prejudices, and that encourages student activism. Each form, this is the writers know this, each form of SEL has implications for issues of social justice. Transformative justice most aligned with distributive justice. And that refers to ways in which valued goods and services like power, knowledge, material resources are allocated equitably. SEL is motivated, they say, by distributive social justice. This is a quote, transformative SEL requires a pluralistic relationship that might foster youth autonomy to lead to social change. I'll stop there.
Yeah, we want to make sure that everybody gets.
Yeah. Wow, that's a lot.
I know, I do.
Take my hand. You're in the classroom.
Everybody gets a trophy.
Oh. Right, but I think
Just kidding, just kidding.
answer the conversation from a practitioner's perspective. And so I'm not, you both referenced transformative SEL, and that's not something I'm familiar with, so I'm not going to walk down that road. But what I can talk about is the way that we in the Wilton schools have used the Castle SEL framework. And so I think, just to begin more broadly, I would just wind the conversation back to what is it that we're trying to accomplish with, I can't speak for public schooling, what are the broad goals that we have? And for me, I think like everybody else at this table, we're about promoting and empowering kids, we're about developing great citizens for this country, we're about improving an imperfect human. And so those are the broad goals. Now, specific to the way SEL, so SEL stands for social and emotional learning, and I just take it at its face. What is social learning? What is emotional learning? And that is not a new concept in public schools, although Castle is a little newer in the last 20 years or so. But we have always been teaching kids to be social, right? I mean, think about, the first days of kindergarten. And to me, those skills are part and parcel to becoming a successful young person, successful adult, and functioning in a democracy. I think more recently, when you dive into the Castle framework and you look at the specific skills and standards, you mentioned there's 5 parts to it. And so what are some of those parts? You teach self-awareness, right? Self-regulation, social awareness, problem solving is part of it. And so what does that all mean? So working with kids, working in a classroom, I think teachers and practitioners can speak to this probably better than I can, but we know there is a clear relationship between emotion and cognition. And so as we have understood the research, we know that kids learn best when they feel safe and when they feel comfortable, when they feel socially connected. And so as a practitioner, I see the purpose of those standards and that framework about creating conditions in the classroom and teaching kids into the skills so that they can feel comfortable and relate well in a community, a classroom community, a broader community. So and you mentioned Ruler before. So we use Ruler in the Wilton Public Schools. And Ruler is really a tool and a set of skills around teaching young people, teaching adults too, emotional identification and then emotional self-regulation. So when you go and speak to the folks up at Yale who have put this together, one of the first questions they'll ask you is, do you know how many words there are in English language to describe emotions? Billy, any idea?
No idea.
What's your best guess?
Emotions?
How many words? Right? How many? 2,000 is what they will tell us. Think about that for a second. There are 2,000 words in the English language to describe emotions. When I kind of first sat and was reading about this, I could probably come up with maybe 25. And so the point is that emotions are complex. And so if you just kind of think about your own experiences and how you self-regulate, one, do you have a vocabulary of 2,000 words to help you really precisely understand what you're feeling in a moment? And two, do you have a set of skills that can not only help you identify what you're feeling, but also help you regulate so you can function in the environment that you're operating in? So that's the foundational piece of Ruler as I see it. What else do I want to say about this? I'll stop there.
Yeah, as long as everyone gets a chance to just touch on what SEL is, then we're gonna get to the question.
Yeah.
If I can feel some coming up. exhausted.
Do the audience have any questions?
That's all one, but we're gonna get
We
through
wanna-
what the definition
We
of
want to
SEL.
get a sense of what we're talking about.
Yeah,
What is
about
SEL?
who thinks what is SEL.
So for us, SEL, when we did some research to understand what the roots, when we did some research to understand what the roots of SEL were, we found that although CASEL started in 1994, the real roots of social emotional training tie back to the Soviet psychologists that developed the concept in the 1920s as part of his studies on how to brainwash children. So this is really the origins of social emotional learning. And it's kind of dark and no one wants to think about that, but that's really what it started as. And perhaps when CASEL started in 1994, it might have started off with good intentions, and I think it really sounds lovely when you listen to what their intentions are about being improving self-awareness and acceptance and all of these things. But what happened is in 2019, this program became radicalized and turned into this concept of transformative self. I don't think that most of the people that teach these concepts now realize that this transformation took place. And so what happened is the people that run CASEL and the people that run Ruler started to implement this same kind of, these same concepts. And these concepts are rooted in equity, which is not treating people the same way, it's treating people unequally to supposedly obtain equal outcomes. They're rooted in this concept, as we talked about before, of intersectionality, which is analyzing yourself through all of these different lenses, the color of your skin, your race, your sex, your gender, all of these things to understand where you fit in. And this idea of well-being and acceptance now, and this new transformative definition of SEL is being used to promote CRT. It's also being used to promote gender fluidity and all of these other kind of agendas. That's where we're seeing this come through. In 2018, I pulled this statistic out because I thought it was really fascinating. In 2019, SEL was introduced into over 200 pieces of legislation around the country. 200 pieces of legislation, including in Connecticut, where there are policies that require that SEL be taught, although it's not clear exactly what they mean by what SEL needs to be taught. And so there's a lot of room for interpretation. And what we've seen that this means in Greenwich, and this Ruler program is a nightmare. In my experience, it's a nightmare for children, because what we've seen in Greenwich is at least 10% of academic classroom time is lost to standalone SEL lessons. So 2 times a month, science is completely replaced with lessons on your emotions. And this is really what this is it's obedience training. This mood meter that we're talking about in Ruler tells children that these are the acceptable behaviors. And if you don't behave in this acceptable grid of behaviors, then there's something wrong with you, right? And while children are doing these assignments, you can imagine, I'm going to tie this back to what Attorney Stevenson was saying, but as students are doing these assignments, they're all online. They're answering these questions online. We had students that were given white privilege surveys and things like this. All of this data is being collected about them online. And you really have to wonder what it's being used for. And I'll tie this to something that we saw coming through with the ARP ESSER program. And I'm sure you guys have some money that you've taken from ARP ESSER. I think all the districts have. But tied to the ARP ESSER program are strings that require you to teach SEL. And in our ARP ESSER application, there are also strings that require the school to put in something called wraparound mental health services. And these wraparound mental health services are envisioned as standalone behavioral health centers. So it doesn't take too much imagination for parents to go, so they're having them do the mood meter in class. They're collecting all this data. How do they decide who goes to the behavioral health center? Who gets sent there? Do parents know what's going on in that center? Are prescriptions being offered? We don't know. All of these things are unknowns and we're not getting answers to them, but it feels like obedience training. It feels like people are being, like the students are being trained to think in a single mindset. They're being graded on how well they think in this mindset. And so there's obvious concerns about how that may or may not be in line with what the parental philosophy is in terms
You can hear me now, okay. So I'm gonna again speak as a teacher and as a parent, and I think that's really important because I've been teaching for 25 years. So I've gone through the Connecticut Mastery Test, which was on paper, and I've also gone through the NWEA and SBA. In fact, I'm in the middle of SBA testing currently for the next couple weeks. So we could have a conversation about testing another time, but I don't really see the link between the SBA, NWEA, and the SEL itself, because at least not in my classroom. And at least not in the classroom teacher that I work with. I happen to be a team leader currently for my 5th grade team, and we have every single week, 2 to 3 times a week, we meet as a team in these things we call them IETs, but they're PLCs. Teachers get together, we look at data together, we look at conversations about what's going on with students, and we do talk about Romero as well, because that is part of our system. I need you to realize that in the past couple of years, we've all been online, and there's so many things that have happened in that online period. However, luckily, this year we're back in person. And because we're back in person, it is important to note that most teachers, at least myself, again, I can't speak on everybody's behalf, but I can speak for the teachers I work with, we are not on computers as much as humanly possible. So when you talk about the ruler being used in the classroom, most likely what you're going to do in an elementary school classroom is see the 4 colors. And then I know a teacher who uses it in their classroom with a Post-it. And they put a Post-it on there, and it tells how they're feeling about it. It doesn't say their name, it doesn't say anything, but underneath it says, if you'd like to write me a comment, go ahead. None of that is tracked online in that particular classroom. We have lots of conversations on our team about how we're going to work with students, how we're going to help them. This pandemic hit students very, very hard. And I need to give a personal example from my own life. My son, as I told you, is a freshman. And this really makes me tear up in saying this. I heard you talk about the health centers and things like that. I am very, very happy that Bethel has that possibility here, and I'll tell you why. One of my son's friends at 2 o'clock in the morning threatened to commit suicide. And he did it through a server called Discord. And all these kids are involved in all these different social medias. So again, he's 15. I just gave him social media this year at age 15. He got a cell phone at 13. So I'm not a parent who gave my child a cell phone at age 9, anything like that. He got it at 15. His sister, turning 13 this year, just got a cell phone. So I think it's important to know. My son comes to me, he has his cell phone is put away, it's in the living room, he doesn't look at it at 2 in the morning, no one does, it's shut off. But another one of his friends was on the Discord server, and the next morning he wakes up and he looks at it, and all over the place it says, we need to get to his house now. I'm like, what is going on? Now I'm a parent and I'm involved, and I said, please tell me. I said, I'm scared, I don't know what to do. He comes to me, we look at the server together, we take pictures of all of them, and I don't know this kid, because in high school, you don't know every single that your child is hanging out. You just don't. They're in this brand new world. So this child was threatening to commit suicide. My son's friend was like, I don't know what to do. I called their parents, I called all the parents all around me, and I got them involved. And we found the parent's number, and we went to the parents, I need to go ahead, the parent that had seen the emails, go to the house and help out. But it wasn't enough. We called the schools, and I called my friend called the assistant principal of the middle school, Margaret, I think is how you say her name. She was wonderful. She said, we're going to help with this. We're going to do this. And she got involved with the family, and she got them the services that they needed. My son came to me and said, Mom, thank you. I didn't know what to do. And you got involved, and the school got involved. This boy's been at my house recently, and yeah, there's stuff going on with him, but he didn't commit suicide. And so I think that it's really important to notice that there is a misconception of what SEL means. Social emotional learning. It's the emotional stress of the children that we're going through right now. We as teachers are put in a position where we need to help them. And we are not teaching them about race theory in class. We are not teaching them about all of these things. What we're doing is trying to help these children who are struggling. If I find somebody that struggles in my classroom, there's a system in place. I will call my guidance counselor, say, I need to talk to you. The guidance counselor comes down and tries to figure out what's going on, and then we work on it. And they work 100% with the parents. They will call the parents, they will set up a meeting, they will do what they need to do. If it's child special services, we have a school psychologist, and the school psychologist meets with them as well. So I just feel like there's a lot of misconceptions around what social emotional learning means in the schools. Again, I'm an elementary school teacher, and I have children that are in the middle school and high school. I can't speak on what the curriculum says there. I can only speak on my own experiences. But I think that's important to note that there is a misconception about what this means in the classroom. Teachers are not trying to teach your children. They're not trying to take power away from you. They want to work with you. The first thing a teacher wants to do is talk with the parent, 100%. If it doesn't work with the teacher, then you go to the team leader. it doesn't work with the team leader, you go to the administrator of the school, then you can go to the next step. You have to talk to your teachers. I think that's the most important step in this, and often I feel like teachers are being attacked because they're the ones that were given programs and things like that to teach. I've been doing this for 25 years. Different programs go through at different points, different social and emotional things. I think it's important to notice that these children need support in all different ways. Parents, teachers, administration, we're all working together. So.
I have a lot to say, but I'm only going to say a little.
Sorry, I didn't mean to talk.
No, that's okay. I wrote down so many rules already. And I'm going to respectfully disagree probably with all of you on some things. First of all, if it takes this much trouble to define what SEL is, then we've got a problem, don't we? And that's kind of the point. With all due respect, a lot of teachers are trying to teach your children things that you may not approve. I know some, we probably all know some. I'm teaching. My mother just retired recently after nearly 40 years as a school social worker. I remember the phone calls she got in the middle of the night from teenagers who, were faced with unthinkable things. And she literally saved lives. So I know the important role that schools play when it comes to providing a safe, secure environment for our students. And they've been doing a good job of that for decades. What we're seeing now with SEL coming into our schools is not making things any better. It's making things worse. And part of it is because it's often being linked to controversial concepts that schools have no business teaching. We're struggling nationwide to cover the basics, to cover basic academic instruction. As a teacher, please leave me out of this. I want to teach my kids in 6th grade social studies. That's what I was hired to do. Let me teach. I make this promise to myself every morning on the drive to work. Any child in my room who I sense is struggling, whether it's conversations go over here in the hallway, whether it's facial expressions, especially now with the masks are off, thank God. If I detect any hint whatsoever of a problem, I will make sure that child receives the help that he or she needs. Let us do that. Let's get back to common sense and not use this giant umbrella of gobbledygook. No offense, I'm not talking about this lawyer or this school superintendent, but there's so much gobbledygook that comes from administrators and boards of education and especially bureaucrats in our capital cities about how to define these terms, and then we have no idea what it means. And that's part of what's at play here. So I'm going to wrap this up real quick, but you're not helping children find an emotionally secure environment if you're poking them every single day saying, are you anxious yet? Are you anxious yet? Are you anxious yet? Are you feeling emotionally secure? Are you emotionally secure? Are you sure you're emotionally secure? What do you think the result of that will be? And our school uses a program called Second Step. My grade, 6th grade, we just started to unroll it. And I can say for the most part that the lessons are fairly mundane and there's nothing too controversial that I've come across. But it leads conversations in directions that, speaking as a father now, I don't want teachers having those conversations with my child. You do not have my permission as a father to talk to my child about those things. Again, if you sense a problem, if you see there's evidence of abuse, by law you're required to do something about that. But if my child's having an ordinary day and he's there to learn his ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, no, you don't have my permission to speak to him in front of his classmates about emotionally loaded topics that God knows what that'll bring up. And my message, I hope I get some questions about this. My message to the teachers is that I don't know statistically where teachers stand on these issues, their opinions. But there's a great deal of silence. And that silence is enforced sometimes by administrators, and sadly by the groups that ought to be standing up for teachers, the unions. The unions are political arms of one particular political party. And they are cheerleading this, as we've heard. They're beyond cheerleading it, they're promoting it. And they've trained teachers to keep their mouths shut or else. So decide for yourself what SEL means. I don't think I'm going to convince you, no one else is going to convince you. But for teachers, vote with your feet. Get out of the unions. Parents, vote with your feet. Opt your kid, if we're worried about emotional learning, why are we bludgeoning our kids with the smarter balance assessments right now, all spring long? You have a right, as parents, send in a letter, opt your kids out tonight from the standardized testing. If we were so concerned about emotional learning, we wouldn't be forcing these ridiculous waste of time tests on our students. So decide for yourself what it means, but then just vote with your feet. And don't let anyone tell you you're wrong as a parent or as a teacher. No one's coming to the rescue for these teachers. Teachers have either got to speak up, because the unions aren't speaking up for us, and they're the one group that should have. They foisted this on us, and they were the one group that should have prevented that. Okay, I'll shut up.
Okay, so after all that, I'm much more unclear about what SEL is than when I walked in here. And here's the thing that just came into my mind. It's like maybe there's SEL Light and SEL Deluxe, because it seems like there's different aspects that might be more enhanced in different school districts or different, yeah. So let me just ask this. The thing that strikes me about from everybody is this does not seem to be a program that has evolved organically. It seems to have been implemented, and that's something that I think goes against what we want to do and educate children, that there should be an organic outgrowth that comes from educators and their experience with students, and especially parents who are, want to teach their own children their own values. So it's a really hard balance. So somebody had a question. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if this is a question or a statement, but as a parent of 3 students, I have a 6th grader, a kindergartner, and a 3rd grader in Bethel. I'm also an educator, 1st grade, 15 years. I very much agree with your idea that it's SEL light, because as a 1st grader, I read books about friendship, and I read these wonderful things, and I say, oh, we're talking about being friends. However, my daughter entered middle school this year, and she's never been bombarded with as many things of the nature that we've been speaking tonight that are absolutely inappropriate, that are against what we believe, not only our values, our opinions, and different things. And in a lot of ways, we have conversations about, okay, well, how do you feel about that? What do you think about that? But on another level, where is a parent's role? Where do I get to say, no, you can't give my student a survey about when her sexual experience was, or if she's tried crack cocaine? Where does that come in? Because that's a survey that's going to be given to students in, I believe, 8th grade. Where do the parents get to say, and not just, oh, you can opt out if you want, if you happen to have seen the email. Where's parents' roles in this? Because you're right, in 1st grade, as a 1st grade teacher, when I'm teaching a SEL lesson, it's about how to treat your friends. It is. But we're getting them ready for the big stuff, and we are going into an area where parents should have a voice, should know what's going on, and it should be a broader conversation, in my opinion.
I think that's where a lot of people are now. It's in this state where it's the opt-in or opt-out. One would think that as a parent, you would opt in, but it's always incumbent upon the community member or the parent to, ferret out the information. That's what I found as a community member.
Let's ask the superintendent.
Okay, let's ask her.
You're right there.
He's right there.
What is it?
I'm not sure what survey you're referring to here. Maybe the developmental assets?
There's different surveys that are going around, and there's
Sure.
discussion and emails sent to parents about it being administered to 8th graders.
Yeah.
And I know that there's, it may not be the entire thing, but I think we're heading in directions where that's where they're trying to get us to. And they're exposing children, I mean, the 6th grader is still a child, the 7th grader is still a child, to things that maybe some know about, but many do not. And I don't think that that is a school's role to introduce those concepts to children. Whether or not that might be something affecting some students, that is a parent's responsibility if they want to discuss that with their child, if they want their child to feel.
Sure.
So it is something happening in Bethel, and it's happening in other areas as well, and I think that we're going to be seeing more and more.
Sure. So I think two things I would say. First, I think the call of what you're saying, what others are saying, I think Kim echoed it too, really speaks to this strong desire to know more, to understand better, and to have a relationship with the school. That's great, because that's exactly what we need to have happen. I think something I used to say back when I was a principal at a Catholic school, and it's true everywhere, as schools, parents are the first educator, and schools are there to partner with you. And so I think that's a relationship. It's helpful to have that reminder sometimes. And so, for all school systems that are busy, looking after kids, trying to deliver a curriculum, the busyness of the work, sometimes we lose sight of the importance of that partnership. And so I think having a reminder is really helpful. And I would say that here in this community has a long tradition of partnering with parents. And so my first question would be, when's the next opportunity, either with the board or with Dr. Carver, with the principal, to talk about what the survey is, what the contents are, to review in advance, and then to make a decision. With respect to your question, Billy, about opting in or opting out, it depends, right? Sometimes the surveys are opt-in, sometimes surveys are opt-out. There's a concept called passive consent when they're fairly innocuous and you're collecting, information that's probably not deemed controversial. I would say a passive consent opportunity where you would have to opt out is probably okay.
But who decides that?
Well, so I think that's typically, someone like me would decide in consultation with the team, and we look through whatever the information is we're interested in getting, and then we would decide about the best pathway forward. But I think, the other piece that's just really present in this conversation tonight is, I think first, kind of this sense of mystery around what some of the teaching points are. And, again, I can only speak to my local context. But there's also this other idea that has been raised that, there is a nefarious agenda. And I will only speak for my local experience. I haven't had that experience where there is a broader agenda at work trying to indoctrinate kids into anything. I go back to, and you can look at our website, you can see, it's like 3 clicks, it's not easy to get to, but we have the social emotional learning framework that we use in our classrooms, K-12, and so you can see the specific standards that are taught. And Cynthia, to something you had said before, it isn't a package that's delivered from someplace. It is homegrown. Teachers, Kim and her team, and teachers like that across our district, work and they identify the teaching points, and they, talk about ways that they raise these specific objectives. But for us, really specifically, it's about developing better pro-social behavior. So I go back to, getting ruler. To me, ruler, the mood meter, somebody mentioned it at the table before, the mood meter is agnostic, right? There's no agenda with the mood meter. It's in the 2 questions that are typically asked: how are you feeling? So it's an opportunity to check in with yourself. And it's the intention, right, is about promoting an optimal environment for learning. So how do you feel? And then how do you want to feel? And so, we can ask those questions in an age developmentally appropriate way. But what an interesting opportunity as a young person I never had. And so, it was incumbent upon my teacher, to determine how he thought or she thought I was feeling, and then to figure that out. And so to create small moments over time where that becomes part of the classroom community, in my mind, that only serves the individual student, but the whole community, classroom community is
I don't think
well
anyone
better.
is disagreeing that it's wrong to ask someone how they're feeling. I think most people, when there's a concern comes in, it's more for how it affects the older and when you get more involved. But that's just, I don't think anyone is upset about asking kids how they're feeling or identifying a specific feeling. Yeah, it's just a different place.
Yeah, and so I guess, usually, I think, I don't know if you made a point, I just saw your note about, ruler being about compliance.
Yes.
And certainly within a classroom, you have to have some compliance and order, but I would argue that this is not about social programming. This is really about, and again, I'll speak only to my local context.
There's so many questions.
Sorry.
I just want to get to the questions and then we'll be able to speak. Paula.
I interviewed Dr. Carver extensively at the superintendent of the school. And it is like an Abbott and Costello routine. And I listened to these many times. One time it was supposed to be a one-on-one, and she read the assistant superintendent, and it was the same thing. It was like no matter what I brought up, no matter what question, it was defended. And I recently wrote an article, and she put out a newsletter recently, and it sounded like a defense of SEL. I'm saying, well, why would you have to do this if they believe in it so strongly? Now, Dr. Smith, you said something about there's a mystery to SEL. I kind of don't think that's the case. You're almost insinuating that people don't understand.
I actually
And-
said, but I said it first, you referred to what I said, because I do believe it is
Okay,
this.
fine. And I was going to ask you, as a sideline after I'm finished, to bring up how they took out the wording of parents in the mission statement.
Just
Just
tell me,
saying
just
it's
ask,
working
we're asking
with
questions, and we're all friends.
Yeah. No, but that was a very good catch that you had. But anyway, the problem is that it's not that the parents don't understand SEL, it's that the administration is not bringing up the parents. I didn't hear very many of you, there was just a few times somebody might have mentioned parents, but you don't bring that up as yet, and maybe you. You don't ever bring it up, and the problem that parents have, that I'm understanding when I'm reading all my articles, is that they may be very concerned about things that are happening, but nothing is being done to stop it. You know, you could be bringing it up at Board of Ed meeting, and nothing is done to stop it. Now, I'm talking about things that this woman here brought up, which is inappropriate questions about sexuality, gender studies, all of that. Where does it end? And this was, I think, in my case, it was 11-year-old.
If I may, Paul, to be fair, it's occurring to me too that different school districts do different things. And that is what I think is hard to pin down, because you have what you do, what Bethel does. It is all under the umbrella, but like I said, there are different components and different,
There's some similarities too, and.
well, there's a
I'm gonna bring up-
sense it's SEL, but I'm just saying, you're speaking about a specific district.
Since you spoke about parents, can I speak quickly?
Wait, can I just?
I don't know.
can I just-
That's okay, I
Can I just say how it's similar in that, let's just go by recent events, and Bill, you know about this. Two surveys that were given in the same week, 1 to 8th graders and 1 to 10th graders. And the day in between had an event, I can't remember what the name it was, but it was where students were required to go into, what did you say? Yeah, but it was where the students were required to go into a room, and parents weren't allowed. Parents weren't allowed to know the curriculum that was being talked about, even afterwards, and the students couldn't bring their cell phones. Yet, and the parents were told there's going to be counselors roaming around in case the students get very upset. This is insanity.
I know what you're talking about, it's an ACLU actually, it's an ACLU sponsored.
Anti-defamation.
No, it's the anti-defamation.
Anti-defamation.
Oh, I'm sorry, now you get to.
But the
Hold on a
anti-defamation,
second, hold on. Let's have some moderation.
you go to the anti-defamation
I understand.
website, it's not what it used to be.
It's
In fact,
not,
the change
okay.
that I was looking at, it's called, they used to have a glossary, and now it's called extremism, and things like that. You really have to look into everything.
Right, there are
You said
programs, there
changes.
are things that are going on. We're just trying to get a fine point on some of the aspects. We could be here all night. I don't want to be here all night. We have other people, so if you want to ask a question,
Well, that's the question.
ask the question. And then,
The officials, the school officials have the power to do things, but where do they get the permission? Other than legislation that's snuck through and you can't possibly keep up, didn't you just say 200 bills, or who said it, somebody said it? Yeah, you can't, you try to do that,
question.
but it gets approved before you catch it, and then the schools say, well, there's a statute that we can teach.
And the question is, no, we have so many, I'm not being really, I'm just trying to, we have to moderate it somehow.
He came from London.
Yeah, I mean, these people are
So
driving
we
from
all talk, we talk to each other all the time. But these
And you
people
can get
came
each
from
other's
far away.
phone numbers, we just have to, we're really just trying to moderate this.
To answer the question.
In the back.
Federal wants to answer the question.
The superintendent.
Hold on, hold on,
Board of
he's
Ed-
answering.
Sorry, I just want to answer the question. The superintendent works for the Board of Education, so
The
it's
superintendent works for the board of ed.
correct, right? So the Board of Ed would be,
I've done with the board of ed, I've been to many meetings,
right?
You're speaking specifically about your experience.
in other schools' meetings, it's very.
Right, we're just here to ask questions in a calm way. We're not, okay, good.
The question is, why aren't school officials responding to parents' comments about inappropriate questions, inappropriate surveys, that's.
But we're in that space right now in the
So does
nation
anybody have
where
any
people
thoughts?
are asking those questions.
They're not gonna answer that question.
Well,
No one here.
I think I know what we're getting at, okay? A Board of Ed meetings, and at least the ones I attend in Eastern Connecticut, where I teach, where I live and so forth. I see parents a lot in the last 2 years especially, asking questions about pandemic mandates, about SEL, transgender issues and so forth. And depending on the Board of Education you're speaking to, or the town you're in, what you'll often hear, we are not allowed to engage in the public, with the public during this meeting, because that's how the meetings are procedurally run. But then there's very little follow through, and sometimes that message is delivered with kind of a rude tone to it. I won't name names, but I know some superintendents, not where I teach. I'll need to say that a lot tonight, I think. Who don't want to give the parents the time of day. And they have no intention of answering questions at the meeting, and they can get away with it procedurally, but they have no intention of answering the questions afterwards either, or having any kind of conversation. And as Americans, that feels rather anti-American, right? That's very unsatisfying. When the topic is controversial, it feels especially unsatisfying. And then, of course, we're all wedded to our phones and our TVs. We see examples nationwide where parents are treated not just with being ignored, but they're treated with out-and-out vitriol from certain school districts here and there. Those unfortunately make big headlines. Everyone loves a story that sizzles. So maybe the problem isn't as bad as we think it is, but it's bad enough. And I think that's what you might be getting at. That the parents boards of ed don't seem to be responsive to parents.
Well, there's an interesting way.
Hold on.
Let me just answer. There's an interesting way that our superintendent handles that.
I
Everyone was
suck at
asking
this.
questions, she said, I'm not answering questions, I'll answer questions after the board of ed meeting. Now, you have to ask yourself, why is that? If she'll answer them after the meeting, why won't she answer them during the meeting? And that is because it's not on record. It's
Excuse
not on
me,
record.
Deborah is going to speak to that for a moment.
Yes, here's another part where I hate all the lawyers, because what you're describing, that all the boards are doing is taking the advice of the lawyers not to answer questions from the audience and to handle it that way. That's kind of standard, but that's from the lawyers. That's another reason why I hate lawyers. But more than that, the boards don't have an answer because they took the money. And they took the money on a condition, and the condition is you follow these curriculum and these things that the federal government has come down with, and therefore they're stuck. So that's why nothing happens, in my opinion. The other thing I want to mention is this is not just homegrown. This is planned. And by the way, I want to say thank you to all the teachers, because this is not anything of the teachers' fault. They do a great job for the most part, helping all our students. And I appreciate that, because it's needed. But if you look into this stuff, and it takes, it's tedious, and you go down the rabbit hole, but if you do go down some of the rabbit hole, you will find some things that it is planned. And it's planned not just by government, but by lobbyists and think tanks and these people who have an agenda. Did you ever hear of the regional education laboratories? No, I didn't either, but you know what? Connecticut is part of that. Okay, the Regional Education Laboratory Program brings together researchers, educators, and policymakers to provide technical support, conduct research, and offer learning opportunities that inform changes to policy and practice to improve educational outcomes. Connecticut, there's regional education laboratory in Northeast and Highlands. That's one of 10 regional education laboratories, and Connecticut is part of that Northeast Regional Education Laboratory. And what they do is they partner with policymakers, legislators, and practitioners and these think tanks, and they come up with this stuff. And that's why you have model legislation in all of the countries, and then you get to Congress, you partner with Congress, and then it's adopted. And in Connecticut, you partner with the legislators up in Hartford. We've got bills going into mental health. You say, what kid goes to the mental health facility? Well, in Connecticut, we passed a law that says that children can go and get unlimited mental health treatment without the parents' consent, okay, at these mental health centers. So I'll stop there.
Well, yeah, this man has been posing like a Rodin statue for the past half an hour.
I sit all day. I
But thinker.
Me too.
Speak to us.
I got that, that's fine. All right, my name is Kevin. Thank you all for being here, and very much so. I actually don't have children. I do have children in the school system because all my friends who do have children are busy with their children. So they asked me to be here tonight to speak for them, so I will. SEL is a topic of much concern for everybody, but it's like a hyper topic that's really a subset of a bunch of different things that are really the problems that we're facing. It's a lot of words used tonight, a lot of people might not know. Intersectionality, equity, safetyism. You have a bunch of different terms, and I might recommend reading George Lukian and Jonathan Haidt wrote a book called The Coddling of the American Mind. It outlines a lot of the issues that everybody's speaking of up here in a very easy way to understand. And he breaks it down. He's a man with children, he's also a psychologist. So one thing that we're all talking about that nobody said is the people that really pay the prices for all this stuff we're talking about are the kids. Right now, the suicide rates over the past 7 years have, to your defense, especially with young women between the ages of 11 and 14, have gone up over 41%. We are doing something wrong. We are not doing something right. That's proof enough of all of this. So we need to get off this course. Now, I can go in for a long time before I get to my question about the differences.
You'll have your
Thank you
report.
very much for the time.
Yeah,
So you guys have got a long hour to do this. So
guys drive 2 hours.
at the end of the day, we're having a lot of discussion of the issues and what the issues are. But from a parent's perspective and a teacher's perspective, what can we do to push back? Because the decisions that are being made to implement these kind of things come from above us. They come from a governmental perspective because they're taking the money that is forcing the curriculum onto the school systems. A lot of times, you get told by them what has to happen, but you get told what has to happen from your bosses. We're responsible for our kids, though. What can we do to push back? That's within our
This girl here is going to tell
I'm
you.
going to add to that so we can get like a double version. That reminds me of the Arthur Esser tie-in, because they're receiving money from the federal government to the schools, and there are strings. I've read those estimates, and I've read the guidelines of the Treasury Department. See, they don't ever say anything specific, but they say enough, so that you know that you have to implement X, Y, and Z, or you're not getting that money.
Yes, look at parents.
So
To that man's
that's
question.
something, to that man's question.
No, absolutely. I'm on information as well, so
Yeah,
it's good to when I see people, you guys have learned a lot as well.
I mean, you need to get your army together, and you need to get out there, and you need to get loud, and you need to fight back. We've been trying in Greenwich to fight back against the Esser money. We want them to return that money. We don't want that money because the strings attached with it mean that they can bring back masks at any time. The strings attached require them to push vaccines in the school and vaccine clinics with this experimental vaccine. They require the addition of SEL and all of these things. One of the things that we found really useful to help us to fight back against the school is, to your point, they don't answer our questions. They don't respond to what we say in the Board of Ed. They don't respond to anything except a Freedom of Information Act request, because that they have to respond to. So what we found is to try to gather the information that we need to prove our points. We've been using the FOIA process quite extensively. And we've been trying to educate parents so that they understand what their rights are, because most parents don't know what their rights are. They don't know that they can opt out of all of the surveys. There's not a single survey your kids have to take. There's something called PIPRA, that's the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendments. You don't have to take a single survey. That drug and alcohol awareness survey that they pass out is like a commercial to teach your children what drugs are out there. My kids told me that when they got that survey, because we weren't warned about it coming out, the kids just got it, that when they got it, they had to Google what some of the drugs were. Me too. Right? That's not the way that they should be learning about this information. So parents need to understand their rights. They need to know that they can opt out of that. They can opt out of unnecessary tests like physical exams and things like this. They can opt out of the SBACs and all these things. So you need to make sure that your parents know how to opt out, how to do it easily, and do it in mass. Because if all of your parents opt out at once, that creates a problem for the school. The school has to fill that void with something else.
Exactly. This is what we didn't want this to turn into any sort of, we just didn't want it to happen, but it's happening. Just turn into partisan, or like I know you're advising, and that's great. We can only have contact with each other after the fact.
That's the
Okay, so, I mean, we can fight it out, but I mean, it's gonna take all night. And we have people, this woman, sorry, Bill, this woman had her hand up for like an hour.
I think it was first time.
But they, all right.
I know you don't like it.
It's not that I don't like it. I don't like anything.
Okay, I'm the person that started the rally.
I feel special.
Everything happened over the survey. It's very easy for any Bethel parent to do what I did, is raise your voice. And they're afraid, that's why there's no administrators here. That's why they sent.
No, that's not why
That's why they sent the cops to my house.
they
That's
have
why
the
they
award
tried to-
ceremony.
Can you be quiet? Please.
Bill, you were incorrect. They're not here.
Yeah,
to
but
the award. This is what an award ceremony.
They have an award
Yeah.
ceremony tonight.
Okay. They send the cops to your house to intimidate you, and they tell you that you have no rights. You're wrong. Just like everybody on the board here is telling you. So do what I did. Raise your voice. We're gonna do a no confidence vote at a meeting of the Board of Ed who controls all the administrators' jobs. This can be done, because we have the power. Fill out the attached paperwork. Okay? Then that way, your kids don't have to do anything, they're automatically, you have to opt them into everything. If you need help, everyone here in town knows how to reach me, just reach out. Okay.
Now, we have a superintendent.
Do you mind?
Yeah, you got it, Jim. You got to talk to this. You got to speak to this.
Yeah, so here's, I think, first of all, I would say thank you again, because like, this is such an important conversation. And again, for me, there are several things coming through, right, our perspectives, and clearly, it sounds like in a number of ways, there's just missing or incomplete dialogue. And so, just a comment first about the Board of Education meeting agendas. Structurally, oftentimes, and I'm familiar with the Bethel agendas for obvious reasons, I'm certainly familiar with the Wilton agendas today. There's a provision for public comment, and it's comment, it's one-way feedback, it's not dialogue. But those aren't the only opportunities for boards of ed or administrators to meet. So I think my advice would be to maybe reach out again to Dr. Carver, to some others, and see if you can have another go at something like this, where you try to get some across the table conversation. That's number one. Number two, I don't know all of the administrators here in this town anymore, but I know many of them. I hired many of them, and there's not one that I know in a chair today that doesn't wake up every morning with your kids, my kids, the children of Bethel, their best interests at heart. And so I think I come back around to, so we're talking about, federal agendas and third-party private agendas. I try to translate that into school and classroom practice and what's happening. And so, Cynthia, to your comment about the ARP ESSER funds, Wilton received $800,000. I needed every dollar. And, it's not much. Bridgeport got $100 million. Lots of other districts across the state and across the country got lots more than we got. But for us, those funds were directed right back into the classroom to provide interventionists to help grow reading and math support. I think that The question about mental health is a big one, and I appreciate that the gentleman in the audience raised the suicide rate. That's a major, major crisis in our country today. And we don't have adequate mental health services for kids who are experiencing acute crisis. And so I think one of the educational responses that we've tried to make collectively over time is how do we better equip children when they are in crisis to identify that they're in crisis and to understand that help is available so they don't kill themselves. And I go back to what is happening in the classroom. And so fundamentally, beginning in kindergarten, preschool, how are you feeling? What are some words? How do you want to feel? If you're not feeling okay, do you have someone you can talk to? Is there an adult in the school? Do you have another set of connections? It's the social connections that save lives. And so when I think about the work around SEL, that's the good work that I see happening, and it's really intended to help support and grow and create healthy children. It's not intended to deprive you or me or other parents of their rights or understanding. And so my advice would be do more of this and look at the curriculum. It's available. I'm sure Bethel's curriculum is available. It's probably posted.
It's on the website.
And then go talk to your teachers. Ask questions about it.
I just want to make a comment because what we're here for, and it will take up time, and there are, I know, I see everybody. I suck at this, what can I say? But, you know, it seems almost that everyone's pitted against the teachers, and the teachers seem to be the scapegoats, and I don't think that they're not the ones who are in, you know, pulling strings. I think teachers generally do have the best interests of children, but I think also, you know, the whole thing about, I mean, this didn't come from COVID, the suicide rate. It didn't come from COVID. So maybe there's a way to manage these crises where people aren't getting hysterical with their hair on fire over masks and et cetera. It's a, you know, it's a whole deep thing. Madam, yes, and then Monsieur.
I think there's a big concern is similar to what this was saying. You send your kid to school, all of a sudden they're getting a survey. Why can't there be complete transparency? Show us every single survey, every single lesson, every single plan that is involved in SEL. Bring kids into a room and tell them they're not going to have their, you know, their phones and blah, blah, blah. Let us know every single thing. They demystify it, and there's no mystery. Let us know.
Okay, Ms. Romero, I hope it's okay. It's okay, yes. That's me? Okay. I think this is really important what you just said. So you said, let us see every single thing that's going on in the classroom. And I
Lesson plan.
but I hear you, every single lesson plan is what I'm hearing you say, right? So again, you know, I've been teaching 25 years, 3 different districts, and my children. I hear you. So if you have an education background and you are in the classroom, do you know how challenging that is for your teacher to, because there are states where they are telling you, you need to post your lesson plans in August for the entire year. I'm sorry, but I need to individualize for my students. I need to individualize for each child and meet their needs. And I'm speaking on an elementary level, I'm not speaking on a middle or high school level. So I understand the survey part of it, I don't know that because I'm not teaching that level. But what I want to say is that that's wrong to ask for the curriculum in August, which some states are doing ahead of time. Then I have no ability to change my lesson plan. You know, no ability whatsoever. I have to do exactly what's planned in that classroom at that time. For the longest time, we have asked teachers to individualize. We have asked teachers to work with children. And I have several special education students in my classroom. I have a special ed degree, and I pride myself in working at the individual level of the student. And I'm not talking about your surveys, I'm talking in general about what's happening today where they're asking for lesson plans online. That is putting the stress, and as Cynthia said, I can't do anything about this as a teacher. I have to teach what I'm given. If I'm told to put it online on August, fine. I'll put it online, but your child cannot get the individualization that they need from me. If they don't get a math lesson for that day, let's say I'm teaching fractions, right? And they don't understand how to add and subtract fractions with different denominators, but the next day it says I have to go multiply them. That's not okay. I need to be able to individuals for my students. So by saying putting the curriculum online is perfect, but by lesson plans, it's not okay.
I think she's talking about curriculum more.
But the way you said it was lesson plans. And to me, that really stands out because that's putting the teacher at that point.
I am totally with you on the individualization.
But you can't have both.
But hold on, if
But
you
fractions is different than crack cocaine and
I'm not asking about that, but when you're talking curriculum's online, but if I have to cite you every single, okay, so I have a morning meeting, right, at 7:30 in the morning, I talk to my kids, we work together, things like that. Do you want me to post my morning meeting, everything I'm saying in my morning meeting every day?
well, no one ever has it, it's not necessary.
But that's what I'm hearing with
But
lesson
I
plans.
don't, well, see, maybe the word lessons.
It is.
Because for me, what popped in my head was if you're posting in August, or even if you don't post it, how are you gonna know if you don't know who the kids are?
I
But what I'm
can't.
saying is, even if you don't post it, it's going to go along, but there should be some.
So the curriculum is
benchmarks
online,
that
as they
I
said
mean-
before, but I just, that word really stuck with me, and I don't think it's fair, because I think teachers are getting a brunt of this. I think that it's, and here's the other thing, I appreciate all of the people on the panel talking to each other, because I think it's important to have this dialogue. I think it's important for it to be a respectful dialogue, so I really appreciate that. I think this is so important that we're doing this. I don't want it to turn into a negative. I don't want to turn it into an attack on teachers, an attack on administrators. I want it to be a conversation where you work together. Work with your classroom teacher, it's really important. We want to work with you. We want to be involved in this. Okay, yeah, sorry.
Do you want it to?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, and then Will's gonna ask, but I just
I
want,
think-
it's a team.
Yes.
And with SEL, please don't make me post all my lessons, but it's for the whole week. I'll be gone tomorrow. It's just not gonna happen. I can't work that. But with SEL, which more often than not is coming from some sort of canned program that the district is telling their teachers to use. Those ought to be posted. If it's already there, the district already has it, post it. Let parents know what's around in it. Why not? Surveys, especially surveys about controversial topics that relate to health and emotional health and physical health and sexual health and so on. I think it ought to be a matter of, it ought to be legislated that there must be a positive action by the parent to affirmatively opt in. And without that yes in writing ahead of time, school does not have permission to talk to your child about those topics. Sounds completely reasonable. The school gets its way, it can still teach these things if it insists. Parents get their way, their child can be excused from it. And let the chips fall. If 90% of parents are opting out, then the schools will get the message. But I think the bureaucrats in Hartford and Washington don't want to get that message. The message is already out there, they just don't want to hear it. Really quick, concrete things you can do from a teacher's perspective. Take some of these with you tonight, please, from the table back there. Send teachers to this Facebook page, Constitution State Educators. Tell them they have a right to leave the unions. Teachers can leave the unions. Since the 2018 Janus Supreme Court decision, teachers do not have to pay a single cent once they've left the unions. Teachers are still covered by their contract 100% if they leave the unions. Their pension's not at risk. Their health benefits are not at risk. If they do leave the unions are still by law required to represent them fairly in collective bargaining and grievances and everything else, because that's what the union's responsibility is in exchange for the monopoly they have on bargaining rights. And fifth, because so many union officers are either ignorant of this fact or hostile to teachers who dare to leave the union, there are other organizations that exist, mentioned here, the Association of American Educators and the Christian Educators Association International, that will represent teachers for a fraction of what the unions cost, about $200 instead of $800 to $1,000 like the CEA and the AFD charge. And if teachers start understanding those rights and leaving, if they're uncomfortable with what the bureaucrats and what the unions are forcing upon them, then more and more people will get the message. May 24th, we have a webinar. Constitution State Educators is hosting a webinar with the Freedom Foundation and with the Association of American Educators and Christian Educators. Anyone can sign up. I'm happy to provide the information if you need it. We can get it through this Facebook page. Any teacher is invited to come and learn about their rights to leave the unions. We've, just this past week, the Danbury Education Association sent us nasty emails about this. How dare you tell teachers they have the right to leave the unions? With all kinds of misinformation about these people we're under attack. These people are spreading misinformation. No, we're not. We're having a webinar the night of May 24th, where you can hear factually about the 2018 Supreme Court's Janus decision and your right to leave a union. You can hear the alternatives, and then you can decide for yourself. So that's what teachers can do.
Thank you. Will? Oh, okay. Yeah, the announcement.
right,
I got two questions here, and the teachers on the board and in the audience will probably have engaged or had training in this activity, so we're having a restorative circle conversation. Only the person holding this deck of cards can speak. No one up, can't talk because you're not holding the deck of cards.
You're a teacher.
I'm holding the deck of cards right now. So part of the problem with any discussion of this magnitude is that everybody has an opinion, and it's a heated topic, and we all have our opinions, and the members in the audience have their opinion. Something that I feel is important is all the words that have been said tonight. We have our, we'll just generalize, we have our pro-SEL folks and our anti-SEL folks. But have we heard anything from the other side that we can see the other point of view as a platform of understanding where the other side is coming from? I'm passing this deck of cards now. So what have you heard from the pro-SEL that you can see they have a valid point?
Absolutely. We all want to keep our students safe. We want them to feel safe in school. Do I really have to?
You gotta pass it.
It's a restorative circle, and that's our object
I'm
of
out.
speech.
Do you want me to do pro, con, which one would you like?
Well, what did you hear that resonated from the con?
Oh, from the con side.
Sympathize with and
I think it's
understand.
important for them to work with the schools, and I think it's wonderful that they're passionate about making everything about our children. I think everything we're talking about tonight has to do with our children.
Thank you. I think we all want happy, well-adjusted children. I think we all want our children to feel safe in our schools. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. So I completely share those views. And I think that those are good intentions for all of us to strive to.
I would have said exactly the same thing, and I would add that it sounds like, at least for some, the missing dimension is full and complete information for parents who are really invested in their child's well-being.
As I said before, I think this is not about the teachers, and I do understand their perspective, that they're having a very difficult job, and so are the administrators. But I do appreciate the fact that the administrators are caring about the children. I do think, and I think they care about the parents as well. I just wish that there was some other way that the balance could be more enlightened.
So my follow-up question is,
Yeah, you don't have that depth.
the demonstration of the restorative circle has concluded, so we don't need to pass on. But the teachers never received training on how to do that.
He has another question.
Now, something that hasn't been mentioned, and I'd be curious to know if Dr. Smith has heard about this in particular, is the Aperture program.
Is that a survey tool?
Well, it's wonderful that you haven't heard about it, because this is a program being put into Connecticut schools. I'm a teacher, and it's in my school now. And what I'd like to know is the SEL, as we see how controversial it can be. Some people want their kids to be taught about sexuality, and some people don't want that. So it's heated on both sides. Some people think it's fine to have a 9-year-old watch PG-13 movies. Some people don't want their 13-year-olds. So no matter what we decide, people are going to be arguing. So my concern, and what I'd like your input on, is it true that when you have a policy or a curricula, there are norms established? So those norms of what a healthy child should be, who is determining? And this Aperture program, teachers, and I don't know if anyone's aware of this, teachers now are filling out ratings that go directly to the state of Connecticut, and it's harbored in some kind of online registry that determines, for example, if the student has a trusted adult in their lives or other emotional questions. So My concern is, how do you normalize what one parent, what one kid might say, I don't feel comfortable answering that question. And they've been brought up that way to say, don't tell your feelings to a circle of people you don't know. And another parent says, share all your emotions. You have the teacher being the one who determines if that's normal or not. And for all of us, whether you're pro-SEL or anti-SEL, is having this standard of measurement, is that a common problem that we could perhaps all agree on? Because how can we define, it's perfectly normal for my kid to know about sex right now. No, it's unnormal. Who makes the decisions? And should teachers be deciding if they know that kid well enough to make that determination that who knows where this is going?
Use the microphone.
So I can't speak to Aperture. Right. I don't know anything about that. It's not a system or program we use. I can speak to your second piece about asking about, do you have an adult that you trust in the school? That's a question we ask all the time. And going back to the conversation about suicide, it's one of the most important questions we ask. I think it's kind of behind that in terms of, as schools are using surveys, information, and analyzing it in the same way that we would look at and analyze and come to some judgment about student learning data. You look at the aggregate and you look at the group and you try to make meaning to the best that you can. But I also think, to your point about individual beliefs and attitudes, that's the beauty of a classroom in a school. You get the full spectrum of kids and families and perceptions. And so, in a classroom, probably the teacher would be the first best informant because I'm assuming you probably know your kids inside and out. I know Kim does, and I know lots of other teachers that do. And so you kind of take that knowledge and hold it up against whatever kind of survey information you get, and you triangulate a little bit to come to some understanding. But, I think probably, like when you're surveying, that's about a group. It's not necessarily about an individual, because you're looking for themes and patterns.
These are tied to the individual student ID numbers.
So when you're referring to a particular program, I really can't speak to that. Sorry.
Anyone else on that?
I'm not familiar with that one.
I'm sorry, I just want to get some more questions because people have their hands up.
I have a quick observation and a quick question. I had a teacher who already retired in the last century, generation. My grandparents were the first of 5 generations to go to school in Bethel. And they went to one-room schools that both no longer exist. But when they went to one-room school, there wasn't any board of education. There was the school visitors. Had the role of supervising the school. Well, because of this COVID, I was saying, in a way, on a monstrous scale, the school visitors come back because you have the parents looking over their kids' shoulder during the Zoom classes, and your board of education meetings a lot around Zoom. My question is this a beneficial thing, and will it last in the long run? That's my question. Is it beneficial, and will it last?
The online instruction, Zoom instruction?
No, the interest of the parents have taken because of the COVID, really.
Parental interest and involvement is definitely beneficial, but I think like what you're seeing with SEL, we're going to go through highs and lows, through some controversial issues. But all in all, I think it's essential that we have it. As a teacher, I often bemoan the fact that I don't feel like our parents are paying attention to their kids' schoolwork. Certainly not as much as I felt my parents paid attention to mine when I was growing up in the 1980s. So I guess it's beneficial that parents are paying attention. It's just, I think it's a matter of working our way through these controversial issues and using all that parental attention without things blowing up around us in the meantime.
I think it's important to mention that the thing that did come out of this, Connecticut just passed legislation that all public meetings are to be hybrid. So you can zoom in on the Board of Ed where, otherwise you'd have to, hitch up the horses and go to town. So that's a good thing.
Can I just
Yes,
address the
please,
question?
yes.
I think it absolutely is essential for parental involvement, and I think that it will grow because of these controversial issues. But I would also like to address the collection of data and the surveys, because that's really, the collection of all these questions and surveys, it's not really the job of the school. Because the questions you're asking are things that the parents should be doing, and not the school system. I understand that you have an interest when the kids are in school to make sure that they're okay and safe. But that crosses a line with all of these surveys. And I also understand that not everybody has the time or energy to go down that deep dive into where this all comes from. But there is an agenda out there by some of these people that are collaborating with the legislature, making you do these things. And there needs, in my opinion, and I think that's why parents are here, there's a distinction between what the job is of the school district and what the job is of the parents. Yes, they should collaborate, but when it crosses the line, I think that's what we're seeing right now. And that data, think about this, who belongs to that data? I mean, who owns that data? The school or the child and the parent? That data, that information about your child is yours and your child's. But yet, when you leave the child at the school, now they have carte blanche to follow these directives from on high, to do all these surveys, collect all this data, and it's not just staying with the school to help the teachers, help the children. It's going into a massive database. It's called a P20 longitudinal data system. And that, as I said, goes to the state government, it goes to the federal government, it goes to third parties, and they analyze it, and then they come back with more programming and more ideas and more legislation, and the parental rights keep getting back and further eroded. So yes, I agree that parental involvement is essential.
I think I just want to say that there's a sense of naivete, I think, around some of this stuff, because it doesn't end with the teachers. I mean, they're implementing the programs, but I was surprised to see in our own strategic planning commission, the difference between the two plans. The one for 2015, 2020, there were no links in it. This one, there are links to RAND Corporation. So if you do any research on these corporations, it's really stunning, because RAND was part of the military industrial complex. So you have to, if you want to find out the source of these things, I think there might even be naivete on the sense of educators about what this is. And I would encourage all educators to look. You know what I'm talking about.
I do. I'm on the same committee. Can I just answer really quickly?
Oh, that's right.
Sorry. So I want to address that really quickly. I think that teachers we do sometimes get blinders on us because we are so focused on our students. We're so focused on making sure that, we're talking to parents and things like that. The online did make a difference for me. I had to relearn everything, but the biggest difference was my husband, because he was also working from home. And so here I am on a computer, and I'm teaching my class of 22 students on my computer, and my husband's watching me. He looked at me after he said, "This is what you do all day?" And I said, "Well, yes." And I had no idea, because I'm just teaching away. He's like, "Oh my God, I had no idea what teachers did." And I've been married to my husband for 18 years, and he still didn't know what I'd done as a teacher. So I think that's really important that you mentioned about the parents seeing it. It's the first time they're actually seeing what teachers do, and I think that has changed their thinking a little bit. Teachers were a little bit naive on that sense, and you're absolutely right. We are focused 100% on our students when they're in our classroom all day long, doing the best we can for them. But I also forget, not everybody's a teacher. And not everybody knows the same words that we use. And the same is for both of you. Not all of us know those words as well. So I think that's really important.
But you may be administrating stuff that you might not know the genesis of, and that's the point I'm trying to make. And Brad had a question, he had his hand up for a million years, so.
Thanks. Fred Holtz, I publish 7 weekly newspapers in the area. I can tell you one, that Bethel is not the only community wrestling questions like this. Every community is. My question for each of you is this. Every community that I cover has had in some way or another a breakdown in trust between parents and the school system. I think in order to get our arms around topics like SEL, and I think SEL is really a conduit for the issue, probably rather than the focal point for the issue. I'm wondering if each of you could share some thoughts about how communities, parents, and school systems can start bridging this so that the parent involvement can be positive rather than negative, and that the outcome can be positive for kids rather than negative. And some of the school administrators, who frankly have not always been honest with me as the press and with the folks in the community, can feel a little more less defensive about what's going on and be a little more upfront about it. Because I can tell you that as recently as a year ago, a couple of superintendents who were rolling out SEL systems were telling the public that they were not doing that. This is not a thing that creates trust. This is a thing that destroys it. So I'm wondering what each of you might be thinking about in terms of ways to rebuild some of these bridges so that rural parents here, for example, can actually feel like they can be positive about this rather than feel like they got tipped.
One thing that pops into my mind right away is to get rid of that public participation when it's not public participation. Participation means there's two parties. So if the boards could actually answer the questions during a public participation section, that would probably go a long way to at least opening the door to trust.
I would say from our perspective.
What about this, Dr. Smith?
We'll come back.
Oh, you're mixing it up a little bit, okay.
I would say from our perspective, one thing that would be really helpful would be is if the school put all of the curriculum online. Whether they teach all of the lesson plans, I don't know the terminology to your point about the difference between a lesson plan and curriculum, but from my perspective, I'd like to know what books have been approved for my son's English class this year. He might not read all of them, but I'd like to know what is the list that they'll be picking from. And that's something that we lack in Greenwich. We don't have that transparency. We have to issue FOIA requests to find out because the teacher will get, so that just creates this really dangerous environment where people just don't trust what's going on. You would think that if it's something good, then they would be proud of it and they would post that information for everyone available to see. So that would be the one thing that I think is really important, is to be transparent. The second thing that we've had in Greenwich, that I don't know if you have this here, but there are certain parents with certain points of view that don't matter as much as all of the rest of the parents. And that those parents, maybe they voted for someone that the rest of the town didn't agree with. And so their views aren't really treated the same way, and they're not treated on par with the rest of the views in town.
Okay, so I would say that the relationship between families and schools and the breakdown, or for some of the perception of breakdown, is actually part of just a larger dismantling across our society right now. And we have lots and lots of examples of people and groups and institutions talking across each other. And so, when we have meetings, we'll oftentimes start with meeting norms. And so one of the meeting norms we try to implement is to seek first to understand. And so I think, again, this forum is a great emblem of that idea, because people are here in listening mode, and that's really important. So I think in terms of trying to build better bridges, first to Phil's point, COVID's been wonderful on that regard, because parents really haven't been able to see into the classroom in ways that they haven't. And one of the downsides of the rise of technology, in the old days, students used to come home with paper pencil and parents could go through the book bag and see everything. When so much of the content of student work is digitized, again, it's just a layer now removed from, parent oversight. And so you don't have the same intimacy of what was happening with student work. And so I think we need to find other ways, individual connections through parent conferences, forums with boards of education where people can have open dialogues like this and really put issues on the table and talk about them. And then I think to your point, to the extent possible. And you would think in school systems it would be easy. My experience is it's not always easy to just give you the list of books, because they're always changing. And so, it becomes a dynamic request that then needs to be attended to, over time. So there's lots of different ways to do that. Thank you.
Before you terminate, do many parents want this information? In your life as a superintendent?
So many, in the full universe of parents, no. I think in the last year and a half because there's been, so much more focus on they're a good thing. But my general perception is most parents feel, fairly well connected to their classroom teachers, and you don't see, large waves of people.
Yes.
Yeah.
So would you say that shows that parents trust this, that there's trust?
I think, I do think there is trust. And again, just experientially, when there's not, we know, right? Because this is, Bethel's a similar community. People are not unencumbered, right? They're not afraid to speak their minds. Teachers are not afraid to speak their minds, in my experience. And so when something is amiss, you know about it. And if it was amiss with lots of people, you would hear lots of people.
Well, we're still coming down the pipe here with the question from Brad.
I think this is extremely important, and I just also want to say thank you to Cynthia and Michael, because Billy Michael here, because they invited me to come here knowing that I may have a different view than other people, and I think that's really important to say, is that I'm willing to have a conversation with anyone at any point. Some of you in the audience have had those conversations with me, and we're still friends, so I think that's really important to say, that this dialogue is the most important part. I think you'll find there are more people willing to have a dialogue than we think. I think that this conversation makes such a big difference, so more of these is what needs to happen.
We do one on guns.
I was sure.
Okay.
You gotta, yeah.
For building trust. Most parents don't have a choice where to send their kids to school. That's the bottom line. For socioeconomic reasons, it's not as if any parent can just pull their child out of school and send them to private school or start homeschooling if they're dissatisfied. So I think school choice is the answer. If you want trust and if you want parental involvement, then let the parents be the ones making the choice where to send their kids. And as a public educator, that doesn't scare me in the least. If I'm a good teacher, I'll hack it. Somewhere I'll be able to get a job and hold my own, whether it's in a public school, a private school, or whatever other types of schools emerge. That doesn't scare me in the least. And if it does scare me, then there's part of the problem. So if we're not willing to compete and we're not willing to give parents choices, then don't be surprised when parents check out. And don't be surprised when parents get angry or frustrated. Especially then, if the only school on earth that they can possibly send their child to under the current system is then saying, well, you have to put a mask on your child, no matter how much it's upsetting the child emotionally or physically. And you have to have your child sit through these lessons in that school, no matter how offensive you find some of the discussions taking place. So as much choice as possible. Also, short of that, I think we need simplicity. I think schools have to get back to the basics. Nobody here would be better than Deb to quote I'm sorry, not to put you on the spot, but the statute that homeschoolers often have to refer to in their letters. What is it? 10-184. And it spells out what parents are responsible, what topics and subjects their children are required to learn, whether they be homeschooled or enrolled in a public school or some other school. I don't think social emotional learning is in there, is it? So get back to the basics, get back to doing the basic things well, rather than a million things half you know what. I think that would go for a long way towards it. And then also the money with the strings attached, the money always comes with strings attached. And then too many boards of education are afraid to dare to say no to that money. And then we get hooked and addicted to that money. And then before long, we still have the strings attached, and then the money dries up. So we get the strings without the money. So just get rid of the overarching control of the federal government and the state government, as much local control as possible. Simplify, 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 and give parents school choice.
Thank you. Mike, first, the treasurer of the Bethel Independent Town Committee. Oh, well, you were listening to me, but I was announcing you as the treasurer of the Bethel Independent Town Committee.
Oh, yes.
I was
Terrible job.
You mean, yeah, I know, it's something.
An observation, and then the challenge in the form of a question. My observation, listening to people for many, many years at a shop that I owned here in Bethel for a while. Most parents interested in their child's grades, and they are not interested in what they're learning. Now the challenge, and it goes along with what you just said. I experience people coming into my shop from this community who cannot write, they cannot print, they cannot add, they cannot subtract. They can't even read their own handwriting. When I challenge them, what does that address? What does that address? They couldn't read their own handwriting. Will we have our children graduating from high school who will be able to write, communicate in a legible manner, do a simple checkbook, understand the penalties that are written into their mortgage? I don't think we're doing that. 53% of the graduates of Bethel High School, this comes from 10 years ago, it was a statistic compiled by a group in California that you mentioned in your first statement. 53% of our students from Bethel do not graduate from college. Yet our system is designed here to educate them and prepare them for college. Those 53% will not graduate from college in Bethel. They are being condemned to financial mediocrity for life if they're working. I believe Westport was in the high 60s. And I believe Wilton was in the low 70s. This is 10 years ago. And I don't, Doctor, when you were on the board, when I was on board, I asked that question. How many of our students, Bethel, graduate from college? No one knew. And yet we were preparing them for college. And they weren't completing college. My challenge, prepare our children to go to work the day after they get out of high school. Those who do go to college will do well. Those who learn how to work and fit into society will do well also. We are not preparing our children to enter the workplace.
Laura,
this is sort of off of Michael's comment about, I'm just after 2 years of seeing what we've done to children in the COVID world with the masking especially, which I think is extremely damaging psychologically. And that comes from strings attached kind of getting government funds. It's the same thing, right? It's the same. We're sitting there with children in masks in school saying, how do you feel? How do you feel? And you're not allowed to talk about how you feel about the mask. That just seems like insanity to me. These kids are running around. I see children walking on the street with masks on, still. And I'm like, what is happening here? This is crazy. And it's so disturbing. And so how is SEL dealing with that? I mean, are they even addressing it? Are they? I mean, can a child even say, I don't like this on my face?
I can say something that
Okay.
No. So again, 5th grade. Okay, so I'm not talking middle school or high school, but I do have my own 2 children. One of my children, as soon as the masks were told that they could come off, took it off. The other one still wears hers. I let her wear hers because it should still be a choice for them to wear them. So just the same as when, people were told over and over again, put your mask back up, put your mask back up. The damage that people think that caused, it's also causing damage to students who still choose to wear their mask. It is really important to give them both choices right now because my daughter should be okay to wear a mask. I don't wear a mask, I'm not wearing one now, and I don't wear one in my classroom unless I need to. But my daughter still wears hers. I think that's very important to do both sides of it. So let me tell you a conversation I had in my own classroom with a student. This had to do with vaccinations. When vaccinations started to happen, and they started to happen for the under 12 group, because again, that's what I teach, children talked about it in the classroom. I didn't start a conversation, but they talked about it. So as an educator in my own classroom, I have to address it. I can't just let it be a rumor of this and a rumor of that, and then them making fun of each other and all this. So I addressed it. I said, let's have a conversation. We sat down and I said, right now, your parents are making the choice of whether they want to give you the vaccine. It is their choice and their choice is the right choice. And these are the words I said to my students. A student went home to her mother and said that I was telling the kids that they needed to be vaccinated. It was just, rumor mill sort of thing. And she went home and she called me. And this was great that she called me. I said, thank you so much for contacting me. Let me tell you what really happened in the classroom. And I told her. She's like, oh, thank you. And so the conversation happened and it went no further. And then the next day I said, we had another conversation. Said, if you choose not to get it, your parents are still correct. Whatever your decision is as a parent, I'm not making that decision for you. And I never shared the decision about what I did, because that's not my place in the classroom. So I think that's important to realize that as a general educator, this is what I'm doing. These are the conversations I've been having all along. I can't not have the conversation, because then it becomes worse. And these kids are trying to figure out what's going on. So the conversation I had is, let's talk about this.
Can I hear what Jackie would have to say about that, or somebody who is on the opposite side of this?
Anybody can address.
Or anybody, I mean, anyone on the opposing.
So, Mike, anybody?
Okay, so my take on the mask issue is that you should teach your children the truth about it. And the fact that parents are out there teaching their children that they should still wear masks, I think is wrong in my opinion, because all of the science shows you that masks cause many more problems than they solve. The virus goes right through it. They don't stop. It does not stop the transmission. The vaccine doesn't stop the transmission either. That's clearly detailed on the package insert that nobody bothers to read. So I think that my perspective on this, and it has been the same since day one, my children, by the way, I had a mask exempt child who never wore a mask in school, even in the time when every other child was the only child in the district that didn't wear a mask. And he understood the facts about what that mask did, what it caused for him. It caused him breathing problems, it gave him hypoxia, it was not good for his Lyme disease, it was a disaster. So I spent a lot of time making sure that he understood the actual science about it. There's not a shred of science that supports masking, so I can't allow that, that's my view.
As a teacher, I think now everyone's all about mask choice, but initially, so many students and teachers were shamed for questioning things, let's face it. And myself, a little heat for not necessarily in school, but for questioning things. And see, this is kind of the point with SEL too. It doesn't matter what my personal opinion is, whether I'm pro-mask, anti-mask, pro-SEL, anti-SEL. My students shouldn't know my personal opinion on these matters. And as you said, the conversation is going to come up one way or another. So as teachers, we have a responsibility to make sure that if it comes up at all, that it comes up in the right context, at the right time, at the right place, and doesn't make any of our students feel unsafe or uncomfortable. So the answer I use is so many things that pop up when they are potentially controversial is that it's not my business what you and your family feel about it. It's not your family's business what I feel about this. We're going to respect one another's choices, and now we're going to get back to our lesson. It depends on the context in which it pops up. I think that's what's lost on so many people on the right and left, everywhere in between. It doesn't matter what our personal opinion is if we could just respect each other's choices. But sadly, that wasn't done at the beginning of the pandemic. And it wasn't because the science changed or we learned more. We knew when this thing was still in China exactly how it was affecting different age groups and different risk groups. But again, it was pushed. The unions pushed especially hard. Anything to distract from the fact that nationwide our schools are failing in a lot of ways academically. Anything to distract from that and to create an enemy so that anyone who questions the schools and questions the unions could be called, what you're doing is dangerous and it's going to get people killed. Anything at all to really demonize those who thought differently and wanted choice all along.
So what would happen, I think it's what maybe Laura was asking too, what would happen if a child said, I hate this mask, I do not want to wear this mask, how are you feeling? Well, I'm feeling pretty, crappy because I have to wear this mask. And then it was mandated that they wear the mask. How would you handle that? I'm curious.
That was true.
No, I want to hear from the teachers because I really want to know.
We had that conversation a lot, and I said, you know what, you're right. I said, some people really hate having this. Some people really are using. I said, right now, the school rule is that we have to follow this. I said, so right now, we're doing what the school is asking us to do because that's, and again, we teach them that they have to, because in school, you do have to follow certain rules. We did not have a choice in that. That's what we need to do. So therefore, we had that conversation, but we validated and said, you are allowed to feel this way. You are allowed to feel this way. And throughout the whole thing, the teachers had that conversation with kids, at least the ones I know, and myself. You are allowed to feel upset by this. Yeah.
I think maybe it was different in our school. In our school, we had teachers that added correct mask wearing in the grading policy. It was shocking to parents to see that written in middle school grading policy, that 10% of the grading would be based on whether you were correctly wearing your mask and correctly social distancing. So, I mean, for us, we saw something really different. I had situations where, again, being the parent of the only mask exempt child in the district at the time, you would think that people would have known that my child was mask exempt, but on a regular basis, he would be accosted by teachers in the hallway who would yell at him for not wearing a mask, which would then trigger exactly the condition that he had the exemption for. So we had a really different take on how all the masking stuff went down.
And it varies from district to district, how teachers are teaching, and that's the whole thing is, and I really believe this, that there are districts and then teachers and mindset that it's almost like you're inadvertently, like, I don't want to say poisoning, but you're handing out these things and then people have different ways of doing it, where sometimes it can be harmful. Not you, but there are people who are maybe so devoted to following it to the letter, like the masking and SEL, that can become a problem. Would you agree with that, Dr. Smith? I mean, overzealous.
Giving the 10% of the grade. You as an employer of that individual, you would throw them out. What did you do?
It's hard to fathom.
Speak into the mic.
It is hard to fathom.
It's not working.
I can't speak for your context. It is hard to fathom that a teacher would assign proper mask wearing as a grade. I think about the last, 2 years now, in my role, coming into and through the pandemic, we're charged with the health and safety of all students, teachers, in a communal congregate setting. And I come to the conversation with a lot of humility. I'm not an epidemiologist or a virologist. I try to stay in my lane, but I know them, and I've had lots of conversations with people who know a whole bunch. And I think there are those that would argue with you about the science. And so as we were trying to tap into the expertise that was available to us, we leaned very heavily on the State Department of Public Health. We still do today. There's a conference call at 8 o'clock tomorrow. We lean on our local medical advisor, and we try to establish policies and practices with the best understanding of what the research is informing, and with the aim of creating an environment that people can operate in. I think there are questions today about masking. Certainly, to Kim's point, in the way that classroom conversations were constructed, it would be my sincere hope that students would feel very free to state kind of where they are with this, and the teacher would respond in the most loving way possible. So that might be, we're going to go take a mask break because a lot of you are really not tolerating this well right now. And I think that happened a lot in our context. I have to imagine it happened a lot in a lot of classrooms around this country. Again, you come at it with, this kind of child-centered perspective first. Also, with an awareness of what you know and don't know, and what you see as the guidance and the rules.
Question,
Yeah.
CASA, your organization, was there any pushback from the association, Connecticut Association of School Administrators? Did they say these masks are destroying our schools?
No, there were certainly questions. I think that, I can't speak for that organization, but I think as time went on, more research became available and an understanding of, just what the broad impact of living in COVID, and I'm not speaking specifically about mask wearing.
Right.
Again, my general sense is most kids, most adults tolerated mask wearing relatively well. That's not true for every kid or every adult. But and I would also say, in conversations with my colleagues as we were coming into February, there were very few people who were, really pushing back at this idea that masks could be optional. It was the rare person in my role who thought masks should ought to continue, with mandates.
Can I just add that masks, in my opinion, are part of the same obedience training that is being push through social and emotional learning, and I think it's disgusting, and I don't think that it should ever happen to anyone ever again. I think that's something that we need to make sure as parents that we enforce that this never happens again anywhere in the US.
And I would just add to that, from the legal perspective, that parents do have constitutional rights, even in school, so do the students. And they should stand up for them as much as they can when they need to. And also the school administration needs to be aware of what those rights are and it's not just rules and guidance. Rules and guidance are not legally enforceable. There's a difference between policy, rules, and guidance and actual constitution and statutory and regulations, okay? Statutory laws and regulations. Those are legally enforceable. Policy, guidance, not legally enforceable. And there's also something that nobody ever mentions is OSHA. And when you wear a mask, there are rules, there are statutes and regulations that have to do with what kind of mask you should wear and what kind of circumstance. And a lot of the rules and guidance ignored the OSHA statutes and regulations. You have to do fit testing for a mask, to wear a mask, see if the person is able to wear a mask. There are all sorts of regulations and statutes about that, and nobody even talked about that. So legally, regardless of your position on it, you have to follow the actual laws.
But I do have a question about that. So I hear everything about, the forces of having a mask on. Now it's a choice, right? So I think it's really important for us to also have that discussion. I'm sorry, can you guys hear me? I think it's really important also saying, is it okay for the students who want to wear masks to let them still wear masks? Because that should be a choice as well. I hear what you're saying, but there are students who still want to wear a mask right now. This could go into the SEL, and it could go into how they're feeling about it. I don't want the students who are choosing to wear a mask in my classroom to have to go through what you're saying, like your son went through by not wearing a mask. So I think if we do that to students who, as a choice of wearing a mask right now, for whatever reason, I never ask why they're wearing a mask. If they want one, I have it in the classroom, they can take it. If they bring their own, they can wear their own. But I think it's important, is that a choice as well? What do we do for those students who still want to wear that? Is that okay?
Are people being teased for wearing masks?
Yes, absolutely.
Real quick.
More than
What she just said,
Absolutely.
it's a great point. What she just said is exactly why we should have respected choice in the first place. Because I went to Board of Ed meetings and implored my Board of Education to please allow choice. Again, it's not whether I personally like the mask or dislike the mask, but whether I believe that every human being has a right, or their parents, if they're a child, has a right to decide whether they're going to wear something across their face all day for 8 hours. But we didn't respect, let's face it, we didn't respect that choice. We villainized people for daring to ask for that choice. For well over a year, I don't know how long it was before we finally turned on a dime and said, now we're going to have choice, and darn it, we're going to respect everyone's choices or else. That's not how it was.
There is bullying going on with it, yes.
Okay, we're gonna wrap this up a little bit, but you, Billy, insist that you ask your question.
Everybody should get one question.
Okay.
Yeah, first you get a question. All right, it's the one thing that everyone came to the point that, when you guys were discussing it, everyone said that the students' needs and how they feel and how they get their education was the most important thing. Everyone seems to have a vast difference of opinion on how to get there. And the SEL portion of it, I think a lot of people believe there's some kind of need for some form of that, but the way it's getting done isn't the correct way. It seems like the students need some form of SEL. The teachers agree with that. The governor and the politicians need to fund it. So they reached out to the pharmaceutical companies, condom companies, and all these other places to fund it, to pay for this education. And now it seems like there needs to be regulations, kind of like campaign contributions and things like that, to regulate, to make sure that the education isn't tied to that money, but that money still comes in so that we can provide these programs for people. It's just kind of confusing, and Deborah, you were mentioning before, it seems like the whole thing is just based on money and bribes. But it's something that kind of needs to be at least presented to students, but there needs to be regulations for it.
Well, a couple of things come to mind, and one is, I think you had it a little bit backwards, because it's not that we see a need in the school for social emotional learning and let's go find the money. No, it was the idea of other people that are lobbyists, and then they go to the politicians, and then the politicians adopt a law that says, here, you can have this amount of money if you do X, Y, and Z about social emotional learning. What did the teachers in the schools do before social emotional learning? If they saw a student that needed help, they'd help the student. I'm quite sure of that. We didn't need, these think tanks and this money and this bribe system to get to that point. And I'm quite sure if the teachers and the administration saw a need, that they needed somebody to help train them or do something and to help these kids, they would have said so, and the board would have.
So
But
you
that's
don't-
not how it actually happened in this.
So you think it happened the other way? Because I understand, I've found that there's, with the social emotional learning education, there's more access for students for suicide counseling and for gender identification, things like that weren't there 10 years ago.
That's true.
So I think that's a positive. Some people don't and would fight about that.
That's true, and you're absolutely entitled to your opinion about that. I wouldn't argue with that. I'm just saying, in this case, there are other people who have a different agenda for putting it into place, and that all parents should be aware of that and then choose whether they want that or not. But that's not how it's been labeled or promoted or pushed.
So how does that get fixed?
I've said this to everybody for years, you have to be your own researcher. You have to look into these things, as tedious, as boring, as time consuming as it is. You really have to know it, because you're not gonna have a lawyer by your side all your life for your kids. It's the parent's responsibility and the school's responsibility to look into these things, and where did they come from? Who's benefiting from this? Where is this information going? Why are we collecting all this data and sending it down to Washington and across to, all these companies? And why? So they can promote and sell Google Chromebooks in your school to get more data? I mean, the thought process has to, I don't know everything about it either. But I'm saying, when you see something like this and you instinctively know there's a problem here, the parents are standing up and saying, I don't understand this is either harming or this is good, where does that come from? You should really learn as much as you can about it in order to make an informed choice about it.
Obviously, not many parents even care about it.
That's true too, but by the same token, they may care, but have no choice but to send their child to that school and not have time to do the research too.
AJ, you have a question?
There's one cog in this wheel that's been missed, and that's the Board of Education. I will admit my research is a little old, but when they're elected to the Board of Education, they go to Hartford, and they go to school. Who pays for the teacher? I asked that question back in the 80s, and again in the 10 years ago, and it happened to be the union that was paying for the teacher. So immediately they're taught and brought into the Kool-Aid district, and then they become not the control or the direction of the school, they can become buddies with the commissioners and what have you. And Jackie, you said something about books a little while ago. Down in Bethel had an older gentleman who had a lot of time. Every time he was on the school board, we had that. Every time they came up with a book, he read it. He'd go back, and guess what? The teacher who's recommended the book, did not read it. They took it from a buddy in another country or something else. So the school board is a cog in this that has to be developed into a different avenue because it just sits there and the union owns them. And the union is sitting on top of the administrators, sitting on top of the teachers. And let's face it, in Connecticut, the school board union owns the state legislature. You've got a big fight to go to get anywhere close to what you want to think of.
Right.
Okay. We've been here longer
Yeah,
than, there's like halftime in football. So, all right, quick, I'm gonna say quickly, I don't wanna be dismissive, but yes, because you've already answered.
I just want to bring up a few points quickly as I can. One is, you spent like 30 minutes or whatever, maybe I'm overestimating, talking about math. Every time the subject of sexual health education comes up, you might talk about it a little bit, but why, especially you, Dr. Smith, why don't you say, this must be stopped? This is inappropriate age-wise, this is that. Why isn't that done? That is why that's the bottom line of why parents are going crazy over SEL. And I'm gonna personally say that this is not dog training. This is, once you ruin the innocence of children, it's lost. These questions alone are traumatizing them. You know, I find it interesting that school officials are saying the pandemic this and the pandemic that, causing suicide. The questions are traumatizing them. You're doing some stuff. The masks are doing it. You have to look at yourselves. You can't be innocent. I just did an article on Dr. Carver with her comments on SEL, which I said is sounded offensive. But she said, this is nothing new we're teaching them. This is nothing new. That is absolutely false. It's absolutely, very new, all of this. I'll end it there. And one comment to Mrs. Stevenson and Ms. Homan. You mentioned that you have the FOI now to get me answers. Well, it's gone past that now because the FOI that I'm doing is getting, and this is my question to you, is this legal? I'll give you an example. There's a ballot and survey questions that happened recently. I wanted the list of questions. And she got back to me immediately because they always do to answer FOI. And okay, we're going to answer your thing. But then when I got the final answer, which was 3 or 4 weeks later, it said it's copyrighted. You can't have it. Now, is that legal? You tell me. It's a private company giving these questions.
I just want to say, I know what she's talking about. I was told that it was available in the board of office. You couldn't take it with you. You could go there and read it, which is a little
A lot of people saw it. The parents could go
I
see
got
it. He got it. How did you get it?
I'm not answering that question, I said it.
Well, it has to be official that you get it, and that's what I was looking for. And if the students already saw the questions, so they could report that back to them. So that's my question to you, is that legal?
That's what lawyer you talk to. But no, copyrighted material, look, there are rules, as you know, under the MOI, there are exemptions to things, okay? If it fits into one of those exemptions, it's quote unquote legal. To exempt it and not give it to you. Is it logical when the students have seen it and your parents don't? Absolutely not, and I have wholly fit just like you are to get that information. Most of the time, things are public documents, but Common Core was copyrighted. You couldn't get the test, you couldn't get certain things like that. There are copyright laws as well.
So let me understand, you can't get the questions that the schools are asking of your child?
Again, no lawyer should answer a question without looking at the law and looking at the facts and applying the facts to the law. But in general, there's a balancing of laws too. So if you took that to court and they'd argue that the people who had copyright would argue it's copyrighted and you can't give it out unless we sign this conditions and all of this, and whereas the FOI law exists too. So a judge would have to weigh that each law and try to interpret it, quote unquote, and make sense of the overall scheme of the statutes. That's the language that they use in the courts.
Can I ask you to feel about it when all hold you to it.
Oh, I feel as a parent, I feel absolutely that should be made public. And I'd go farther than that and say, what is the school district or any government agency doing with a public entity making such an agreement with them on a copyright that they can't give it to parents? Yeah, but there, again, it goes back to who owns the data. The parents own the data of the child, when you're asking the child to give that data to a private company and the parent can't see it, no, it doesn't make sense to me as a parent.
If you go to the website where the company that gave the surveys to Bethel Public Schools, you dig deeper and deeper, it shows that it does go other places. And, I think Bill was saying that, is it really anonymous? Because you have to key in with your number.
The student ID,
Yeah,
for
so-
anybody who wants to.
Yeah, but I found it interesting that, now what are the schools going to do? Only pick companies that have copyright,
Gonna target the kids.
All right.
Well, and that goes to the State Department of Education making these deals. The State Department of Education also accepts money and grants that don't include legislature to be voted on from private companies. I mean, I can go on and on.
But we can't, because we're gonna, hopefully we have a little more time to live, and we're gonna do this again. I'm so happy and so grateful to everyone. Again, we're dwindling now, one at a time, and they're just really.
Well, were you guys all allowed without really a question?
Okay, quickly.
No, it's not a question for the table. I found out about this 30 minutes before